In this video, we're going to focus on comparisons of GDP across countries. We've seen how we can compare GDP over time in the same country using either constant price measure or the chain rule measure. Here we want to see how to compare GDP across countries. The idea is very similar to what we did before, comparing GDP over time, and the problem is similar. We have prices being different in different countries. Relative prices are different, and as a result, we need to correct for that. We need to address that problem. One solution might be the following. Calculate GDP of each country in its home currency, and then turn that number into dollars at market exchange rate. So you get everything in terms of US dollars for all countries, and then you can compare them. That looks like a very simple and straightforward solution. However, there's a big problem with this approach. The dollar buys different amounts in different countries. We need to take into account the purchasing power of the currencies, and for that reason, we need to make corrections. There's another problem with the exchange rates. For most countries, exchange rates change very quickly, even sometimes day to day. It may look like the purchasing power of households is changing very quickly, but that's not true. If you live in a country and you have the currency of that country and the prices you pay for the goods and services that you buy have remained more or less steady, your real income, your real purchasing power doesn't change that much. While the exchange rate changes relative to other countries, you may be experiencing an increase or a reduction in purchasing power, but in real terms, what you can buy domestically doesn't change that much. For this reason, using the market exchange rate does not really reflect what people actually can buy in terms of goods and services. So what do we need to do in order to solve this problem? The solution that economists commonly use is to use a set of base prices in a major currency. It's usually US dollar, and US prices are used. And then we try to figure out what the GDP of each country would be if everybody paid the same prices across countries. This measure is called purchasing power parity, or PPP GDP measure, and it's measured in international dollars. The method is very similar to the constant price method over time. However, here the base is a country rather than a year. If we use a particular year in a particular country as the base, then we have the GDP of all countries in PPP measure at constant prices. The PPP GDP measure is an index of real purchasing power of households across different countries. It helps us compare real incomes. It helps us better understand how well off people are in one country compared to others. The GDP measure that I mentioned earlier, calculated at the market exchange rate, is not good for this purpose. However, it has its own uses. If you're doing business in another country, what matters for you is the amount that you sell, or the value of the value of your sales, or the profits that you make in terms of foreign currency, what you earn in your home currency. So the exchange rate matters, and the GDP of the country in terms of foreign currency, let's say in terms of dollars, that reflects how much profit you can make in that market. That reflects the size of that market in terms of the currency that matters to you as a foreign investor in the country or exporter to the country. GDP calculated in terms of dollars at market exchange rate, it reflects the size of the market in terms of an international currency. That measure, GDP calculated at the market exchange rate, is helpful for business purposes, not necessarily for comparing welfare of people across countries. Let me show you what a big difference it makes whether we use the market exchange rate or use the PPP measure. Here's the world GDP calculated for 2014 in terms of trillions of dollars of 2014. If we use the market exchange rate and we focus on developed countries, the two measures, market exchange rate and PPP, gives us roughly the same level of income. That's because relative prices are quite similar across developed countries. However, if we go to developing countries, because labor is valued a lot less in those countries, the wages and local services are much cheaper, even housing is much cheaper. If we calculate GDP at market exchange rate, we get a much smaller number than if we apply the prices prevailing in the US to the products and services produced locally in developing countries. In fact, the value of GDP of developing countries doubles when we move from market exchange rate to the purchasing power parity measure. And you can here see that the GDP of the world, which was about $75 trillion by the market exchange rate measure, once it's done in PPP measure, it goes well over $100 trillion. So in other words, the market exchange rate measure of GDP across countries underestimates the world GDP and especially the GDP of developing countries. Looking at GDP in PPP terms is very informative for understanding what policies do to the welfare of people in each country, and for that purpose it's very important to keep it in mind and use both measures, one for business purposes, the other one for welfare comparisons. It's like looking at the same thing in different mirrors. You get very different pictures. One can use the PPP measure also to get a glimpse of how the world economy looks like in terms of differences across countries, in terms of the total GDP being produced in the world, in terms of distribution of GDP across countries and across the population of the world. Here's a picture of PPP GDP in different countries, and the horizontal axis here is the share of each country in world population. So the area represented by each country, for example, the area here represented by India, is the total PPP GDP of the country. The height is GDP per person in terms of purchasing power parity measure. So the area is the total GDP, and then you can compare GDP of different countries. In comparison of China and United States, in this case, is very interesting because China's GDP in terms of purchasing power parity is about 1/4 of that of the United States. At market exchange rate, it's much lower. But once you multiply that by the population, you get an area which is very large and very similar to what we get for the United States. So in that sense, a lot of people have started talking about China overtaking the United States in terms of purchasing power parity measure. And here's another graph showing the distribution of world income across the world population. And this graph shows how the distribution looked like in terms of purchasing power parity in 1990 and 2011. And what is remarkable here is that quite a few people used to live with less than $1.25 per day in 1990. And because of the growth rate, high growth rates in China and India and many other countries, poverty has been reduced. A lot of people have moved to the right of this line, and this whole area, population which was represented by this area of the distribution, has shifted towards higher levels of income and have become more middle class than being in abject poverty. World income distribution has improved, but within each country, income distribution has not necessarily improved. And here's an example from the United States. You can see that since 1960s, there's been an enormous amount of growth in the US, but most of it has gone to the top 10%, the 90th percentile and above. If you look at the bottom 10%. Their real incomes haven't changed all that much. Even people in the median of the income range have not experienced much improvement over the past 40 years. However, because very poor countries have managed to grow fast, the distribution of income across the world population has improved. What we've discussed here as PPP measure is one way of measuring well-being. But well-being has many other dimensions, like the value you attach to community, the health services that you receive, the nature of education, satisfaction with way of life, with your housing, other services that the governments may be providing and may not be fully reflected in GDP measure, which focuses on market value of goods and services being consumed. If you would like to know more about the value people attach to the environment, safety, quality of social support, etc., you can check the measure of welfare, well-being calculated by OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, for rich countries and a number of middle-income countries. It gives you a picture of what's happening in terms of well-being more generally and beyond income. Income is a key component of it, and it's very correlated with the other measures, but it's not a perfect correlation. Here's the correlation of GDP per person calculated in PPP measure, on the horizontal axis being graphed against the Better Life Index, which is the welfare index that OECD calculates. And you can see here that there is a strong correlation between the two. However, by no means the correlation is perfect. For example, you have a country like New Zealand with incomes being in the middle of this range on the horizontal axis. But in terms of Better Life Index, the country stands out, and in fact, people seem to be feeling much better based on this measure about their lives than many other countries with much higher levels of income. That includes the United States. There are also countries that have relatively higher incomes, but do not necessarily enjoy high levels of well-being. For example, Greece seems to be below the other countries in its own income range.